tell you a baseball story. It seems that the late and great Gil Hodges told this story that once when he was managing the Washington Senators, he discovered that 4 of his players had broken curfew the previous night. Well, and immediately he called a team meeting and he said, "I know who you guys are, but I don't want to embarrass you. You know the rules, and each of you will be fined $100. I've placed a cigar box there on my desk, and I expect that the 4 of you who broke curfew will put your money in that box by 3 o'clock this afternoon." At the end of the day, Hodges found $700 in the cigar box. Now, what Gil Hodges discovered, I think, is that a lot more people are struggling with guilt than he might have imagined. Guilt plagues every one of us to some degree, I think. For every one of us has to lay our head on the pillow at night and accept the fact that we just have not done as well as we could have done. One Christian psychologist recently stated that guilt is the most difficult problem in the whole world of psychological therapy. Guilt, it seems, has been a problem since the very beginning of time. You remember, it was guilt that caused Adam and Eve to hide when God came walking in the cool of day there in the garden. It was guilt over his adulterous affair that caused David to say, "My bones are almost wasted away while I hid in my sin." It was guilt that caused the prophet Isaiah to cry out, "Woe is me, for I am a man with unclean lips," when he came into the presence of the living God. When the Pharisees brought that woman who was caught in adultery, you remember that Jesus looked at the angry mob and he said to them, "Let the one of you who is without sin cast the first stone." And it was guilt that caused those people to drop their stones one by one and walk away. It was guilt that caused Judas Iscariot to take his own life after he had betrayed Jesus that night in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I think that guilt continues to haunt humankind and has been a companion of mankind since the very beginning. So, how does the cross of Jesus and his resurrection affect our guilt over our sin? I think there's a couple different ways that I'd like to look at this morning. The first way is this: we need to realize that some people will rationalize their guilt. Now, maybe you've listened to people who are caught in the act of some wrongdoing. Not too long ago, a newspaper reported that a man was arrested for stealing a car that was parked at a cemetery. And when he stood before the judge, he said, "You know, Your Honor, since the car was parked at the cemetery, I just assumed the driver was dead." I've spent 20 years in the insurance field, and there come some of the best rationalizations of all times. These are some actual explanations that people have used when filing accident reports with their insurance company. Coming home, I drove to the wrong house and collided with a tree I don't have. A pedestrian hit me and went under my car. A truck backed through my windshield and into my wife's face. I pulled away from the shoulder, looked at my mother-in-law, and then drove into a ditch. In my attempt to kill a fly, I drove into a telephone pole. And my all-time favorite, the pedestrian had no idea which way to jump, so I ran him over. Those are actual excuses that people have used to rationalize their own guilt. And I wonder what those kind of excuses sound like to God when we're guilty of our sins. Now, the second thing I have learned is that some people attempt to deny their guilt. There's a perfect example of that in the Old Testament. Israel was at war with another nation, and King Saul was instructed by Samuel the prophet to destroy all of the property that belonged to the king of that enemy nation. But Saul looked out at all those sheep and all those cattle that king owned, and he began to estimate their worth. And finally he decided to disobey God and to keep those king's possessions for himself. He forgot that God sees everything we do. And God sends the prophet Samuel to confront Saul with his guilt. And so what did he do? He tried to fool Samuel into thinking that everything was great. He greeted the prophet and he said, "Look, I've done everything God told me to do." And Samuel said something to the effect of, "Oh yeah? Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that the sound of sheep and cattle I hear out in the backyard?" And Saul replies, "Oh, that? Well, yeah, I did keep some of the livestock for a sacrifice." To which Samuel replies on God's behalf, "It is better to obey than sacrifice." Isn't it amazing that people have the capacity to deny guilt when the evidence before them is so incontrovertible? Haven't we seen an example or 6 of that maybe on the nightly news anytime you turn on the television? Some people run from their guilt. Bars, hotels, employment offices, quickie divorce courts are full of people who are trying to run away from their guilt. Judas, well, he ended up on the end of a rope. Jonah ended up in the belly of a whale. Peter ended up back in the fishing boat again. The problem with running from one's guilt is that it incessantly follows us wherever we go. All those so-called solutions have one thing in common, folks. They don't work. Some of us here today know firsthand what it is that I'm talking about and know that it's the truth because you have tried already to rationalize or to deny or to escape your guilt. And you have learned that no matter what you do, you still feel guilty. Well, there is a time when the story gets really good. For there is a permanent solution to the problem of our guilt. You don't have to keep fighting that losing battle. You can't really be absolutely guilt-free unless you follow this step. You can let God take that guilt away. You see, God is willing and God is able to remove your guilt once and for all, friends. That's why Jesus went to Calvary for us. Jesus took our guilt to Calvary. Verse 13 of that letter to the Colossians that Richard read said, "He forgave us all our trespasses, erasing the record that stood against us with its legal demands." You know, when I was a child, I remember asking my mom one time, "Why do they call it Good Friday, Mom, if it is the day that Jesus died? What's so good about that?" And what's good about it is this, that Jesus died there on that cross. And when he did, he paid the price for our sins once and for all. Your guilt, your shame, your sin was laid upon him and nailed to the cross. The punishment that you deserve, he reserved. When I was 11 years old, a new girl came into our school. One look at her, and I was in love. She was the prettiest girl in the entire 5th grade. Now, I tried to get her to notice me, but it was no use. There was a boy in our class back then named Jerry Patterson, who was always acting up, and he was the center of attention. And to my great sadness, she fell for him. Well, I couldn't bear the thought of it. Why, she was like an innocent lamb there being devoured by that clever wolf, Jerry. So I devised a plan, you see. I wrote a love letter to her. It was full, folks, of the most mushy, syrupy, corny talk that any possible 11-year-old boy could put together in a letter, almost to the point of nausea, folks. I talked about taking her to a movie. I talked about sitting next to her. I talked about holding her hand. I even talked about kissing her. I held nothing back. And then at the end of the letter, I signed it, Love, Jerry Patterson. And I dropped that note on the floor that day, where I knew the teacher would find it, and he did. And right on cue, he unfolded it and read it to the entire class. My plan worked. Everybody had a big laugh at Jerry's expense that day. You see, he had to take the blame for something that I was really guilty of. And this is what happened when Jesus died up there on that cross, folks. He took the blame for our guilt. There's no use in pretending, folks, that we're not guilty, because we are. But that guilt was taken away. At Calvary, Jesus removed our guilt once and for all. Do you remember the last thing he said before he died? Witnesses to the crucifixion heard him cry out, "It is finished." He didn't say, "I'm finished." He said, "It is finished." His work, the work of removing our guilt forever, was finished when he was nailed to the cross. Now, Jesus forgave our guilt there on the cross as well. Don't ever think that it's an easy thing for God to forgive your guilt. A great price had to be paid. In spite of what appears to be reality today, this has always been, and it will always be, a moral universe. People pay for their wrongdoing. There's a great price to be paid for sin, and God is the one to whom it must be paid. And that's because God is righteous. He is totally 100% holy and sinless. And the Bible teaches us that the wages of sin is death. Every person, folks, in this room is a sinner. Don't ever think that you are the exception and that somehow you're going to get away with it, because you won't. You will pay for it with your spiritual death, or you will allow it to be paid for you on the cross of Calvary. Paul said, he forgave us our trespasses, erasing the record that stood against us with its legal demands. The image that Paul is providing here is that of a person being taken to the debtor's court. He has a statement listing his debts and his credits. And in those days, when somebody couldn't pay their bill, they were thrown into jail until somebody else paid their debt for them and they could get out. And Paul is telling us that God has sent his Son to pay our certificate of debt. Stamped across the very front of it is the words "paid in full," which, by the way, is the same phrase that's translated, "it is finished." God paid the debt that we owed through the death of his Son, Jesus Christ. There's a chorus that many churches used to sing. Maybe you remember it. It goes like this: He paid a debt he did not owe. I owed a debt I could not pay. I needed someone to wash my sins away. And now I sing a brand new song, Amazing Grace. Christ Jesus washed. He washed my sins away. And finally today, I want you to realize that Jesus has forgotten your guilt. He took it away. One of the most neglected doctrines, I think, in all of Christianity is the doctrine about the forgetfulness of God. When God forgives, God forgets. And I would suggest that we could all stand to practice this same kind of doctrine at home. I read recently about a guy who said that when my wife and I argue, she always gets historical on me. And his friend said, "Don't you mean she gets hysterical with you?" And he said, "Oh, no. She gets historical. She brings up everything I have ever done wrong." Well, that may be the way that we treat each other. But it is not the way, friends, that God treats us. Mercifully, he doesn't look at us and see a series of sins and failures. In fact, when he removes our guilt, it's gone forever. Because the Bible tells us in the book of Micah that you, God, hurl all our iniquities into the depths of the sea. And Jeremiah wrote that I will forgive the wickedness and God will remember their sins no more. You might remember the movie Bull Durham when Annie Savoy gave a speech about the Church of Baseball. And she said, I gave Jesus a chance, but it just didn't work out between the two of us because the Lord laid too much guilt on me. Now, I know that that's only fiction, but the person who wrote those words doesn't understand anything at all about Christianity. Jesus, you see, doesn't lay guilt on anybody. He removes it. He takes it away. In answer to my question to my mom years ago, on the day that we call Good Friday, Jesus walked this lonely road to Calvary. And he carried not only the cross on his back, but the burdens of our world as well. And while he hung on that cross, he paid the price for our sins, for yours and mine. And through that act of love, you can be forgiven and you can experience freedom from guilt from now on. And the third day, after Jesus rose, he provided for all the world to see that he is the Lord of all, that he conquered death and the grave. He died, but now he lives again, and because he dies, you can be forgiven too. Because he lives, you too can live in his power. And I think, my friends, that is good news for our church and for us all. Thanks be to God. Amen.